So somehow everyone, the Doom Patrol finale has been and gone, and they definitely made it one of their most weirdest and wackiest and spectacular episodes yet. So let's get into all of the details and break this down. How's it going, Doom Patrollers? Welcome to my finale review of the Doom Patrol Ezekiel Patrol episode 15. I can't believe how quick this series has gone, but you know, this is one of those moments where you can say, truly, time flies by when you're having fun, and man, I feel like did we all have fun with this series. This was just such a crazy and wacky episode, and that feels like you could say that every episode about Doom Patrol, but you know, if you've seen this finale, you'll know that it is probably out there with one of the biggest and weirdest stories they've managed to include, but yet they managed to tie in everything amazingly well, give us some new things which make all of the puzzle pieces kind of fall into place across several episodes throughout the season, and it just left me completely and utterly satisfied, and also left us open for a season 2, which is great. You can imagine where it's going after this, but also guys, I just want to take the time to say before I get into the details, because I've got so much to get through. I mean, I guess you guys already know that there's so many moving parts in this episode. Thank you so much for the support on my Doom Patrol reviews. It's been so fun reviewing this and just sharing my thoughts with you all, but also you guys giving me that in return, us all having a conversation. So I just want to let you know I'm still going to be doing DC Universe videos like on Swamp Thing, and of course I'll be keeping up to date with anything Doom Patrol going into season 2, even though obviously that's a little while away. But yeah, just thank you so much for your support, and I hope you continue to enjoy my other DC Universe content. But let's get into this, guys. But like this video to show your support for the channel and just like Doom Patrol in general. Subscribe for more DC Universe videos. But yeah, we seriously need to get into this because, as I said, there's a lot. So I don't know if you guys skip the recaps, but at the very beginning of this episode, I normally never skip them because sometimes there's little features like this. Mr. Nobody was essentially like rhyming or like had this poem about each character throughout the whole series and their kind of history, and that was just a nice little kind of tie-in. So where does this episode start, everyone? Well, of course, it's got to start with everyone kind of reacting to what Chief said at the end of last episode, but we got an even further explanation through Chief essentially saying that he wanted what they had, and that's their immortality, and Mr. Nobody actually let everyone go because essentially he got what he wanted, and this is something that he's absolutely waited decades for, something he's waited decades to say, and that is for Mr. Nobody, Niles Calder, to be a nobody, or just to say you're finally a nobody. And I thought that was a really kind of poetic way to do things. And I have to say, Alan Tudyk was great in this episode. He was just phenomenal. Now, one of the biggest questions that came out of last week's episode was more or less everyone saying, Boba, but how did Chief, create everyone? How did he do this? How could he have caused Larry to, engage with the negative spirit, and all of those different factors. And they actually did a really good job of explaining each and everyone's creation throughout the episode, and then also merging it with the present day, with everyone just kind of moving on from that moment we saw at the end of last episode with Chief being exposed. So I loved how, we kept going back to the past and present day in this episode. So that kind of started with the ant farm. So we actually hear Chief and Joshua talk about Larry's flight, and this is the Bureau of Normalcy's best way to intercept the negative energy. Now we get explanations of how Chief calculated exactly what would happen after exposing Larry to the energy. Essentially everything was planned, even up to the torture scenes we saw with Larry in the flashbacks throughout the season with a foresight. He knew despite him being tortured, after all of that, he would ultimately end up in Chief's Doom Manor. Chief would get his chance at Larry. And it's just really twisted. If you go back and rewatch this series, I feel with Chief's true intentions in mind and everything he let happen, it really does give you a completely different perspective on the Chief they cast for this version. As I said in the Titans Doom Patrol one, that guy seemed a lot more sinister, and I love the fact that they played it very differently this season. This is where we also hear that the Immortus project, which is Chief's immortality Immortality Project consists of Rita and Joshua, by the way, who we actually saw in the Doom Patrol episode, because Joshua now resides in that kind of care home for like metahuman kids, basically helping people control their powers. It was really cool seeing him again. I didn't expect that, but now, as I said, this is a nice way to link different things up, because Joshua, it was essentially challenging the Chief, and I really liked that. Throughout this episode, different people were challenging Chief, saying things like Joshua said, like, how far is the line, Niles? Or like, why do we need to get Larry? We've already got Rita. Now, there were so many funny parts in this episode, and as I said, there's so many moving parts in this episode that I just can't name it all, otherwise this video will be like 30 minutes long. But I loved seeing how the Doom Patrol's life, was moving on without the Chief. So we first saw this through how Rita was teaching acting now. And Larry doesn't really seem to be doing much apart from just, kind of hanging out with the negative spirit, because we saw him go to that place where he released the negative spirit and just tried to get more and more and more time between his body and passing out and the negative energy just flying around. Now, this is where we got a flashback to 1976, where they're celebrating New Year's for 1977, obviously. Loved Larry's glasses. Big shout out to that. This is what I mean. All these little funny bits I wish I could talk about, but, there's like a billion of them in this episode. But this is where Forsyth arrives at the manor, which is like a very, very risky thing. I mean, imagine if Larry saw him. And this moment with Chief and Forsyth just kind of shows that even though, and Chief says in this episode, it wasn't all about that, like the test subjects and everything like that and the experimenting and stuff. He did get connected to them, but it's like despite all of that, presented with like another subject. And I think in this moment it was meant to like get across to the viewer, like I requested this like 10 years ago. I think Chief, even though he is continuing the Immortals project with like Larry and Rita and stuff, but I think this moment was kind of meant to show, at least from my takeaway from it, is that it's been 10 years. Chief hasn't really got any new subjects since then. Maybe he was kind of not necessarily becoming a good man, but he hasn't done or abducted or like got any new people like he had got Larry and done all those sinister like evil things. To be honest, they really are. And yet typically Chief couldn't resist, which is why he accepts the case file with Jane and proceeds to, as we've seen in a previous episode, rescue her from that mental asylum. So like he carries on because he can't help himself. Now this is where we see Jane in present day, and this was, as I said, I love Diane Guerrero's acting. I feel like Jane took things the most hardest, because for her, everyone's got their own problems, don't get me wrong, but we ever since we saw the tapes with Chief, appealing to like Baby Doll and then like, kind of winning over Jane's a very naturally mistrusting person anyway because of how she's lived her life. So like, how Niles has looked after her and multiple different personalities, it was really, really sad seeing those different personalities come out when she was talking to Joshua. For example, Baby Doll, and I think we had Hammerhead and just a few others. She was just going in between, and every single person of her personalities was in so much pain because of the revelation of Chief's secret. This is actually also a segue into Robot Man's origin, and we see Chief conflicted. And this is what I really like about the character of Chief and how the Doom Patrol show is doing this version, I guess, in the sense of he's such a diabolical man in the sense of what he's doing, but he's very human because we saw him in that scene opening up crying because he never intended for that accident to unfold the way it did. He was meant to die on the racetrack, but it ended up happening on the road, thus effectively leaving Cliff Steele's daughter an orphan, and he felt terrible about that. Chief even acknowledges in this moment, like it was kind of like that pinnacle point where he realizes things have gone too far. He starts having like a bit of self-reflection. And it's just like, even to the viewer, like, even though I like Chief, it's a really weird combination. He's such a terrible man. And if you're wondering about, that secret that he wanted to tell Eleanor, I think it was just to basically explain everything, because in that moment we kind of learned like Eleanor was kind of like WTF, like what's going on. Maybe even told her about his daughter as well. Maybe he gave her like the whole bag of explanation. And what is Cliff Steele doing in present day, guys? Of course, he's looking after Jane, like delivering her food and stuff. Now, that was just such a sweet moment. I just loved it. Now let's talk about that scene back in 2014 in Star Labs, the medical wing, basically just post-surgery of Cyborg. This was an amazing scene. Like, it was very powerful. I already said it in the last episode, I believe. I love the acting portrayed for Silas Stone in this show. But this moment was very definitive for me, at least in this whole episode, just like kind of summarizing the Chief. because Silas gave such a good takeaway from it, at least for the viewer. That really kind of, I feel like, made Chief have this epiphany about himself. Like, we had the one beforehand with Eleanor, but this was like another bit of salt to rub into the wound of like, Chief, wake up, look at what you're doing. I just love how Silas bites back about the compassion and empathy comment from Chief, since he also knows the truth because Eleanor told him. That line where Silas more or less said, like, this wasn't some experiment, I turned my boy into a freak of nature, out of love though. Like, why the hell did you do it, Niles? Now, what is Cyborg up to in present day? That was kind of sad to see in a way as well, because he's essentially having nightmares about how badly Mr. Nobody got into his head, and I completely understand why, because it got to the point where he beat Silas more or less near to death, so it makes sense why all of this is happening, but to the point where he stepped back and he's only kind of solving money laundering issues or cybercrime. He's not, this is kind of sad to see as well, because he's obviously such a candidate for the Justice League, and he's just, for the past X amount of time that's happened since the white space moment where the secret got exposed, he's not been out there in the field. And even Silas, believe it or not, was encouraging him to do more dangerous things. So that was quite an interesting aspect to this as well. So this is where we saw Mr. Nobody and what he was up to. And he was essentially just celebrating living life kind of to his best, or at least attempting to, after what he accomplished with Niles Calder. I just loved how he was reading a review of Doom Patrol in Vibes, which is essentially just this ripoff of Forbes, obviously, and how it said like the worst show ever. And this is when Ezekiel appears. So like, obviously we knew something was going to be big with Ezekiel because it's called Ezekiel Patrol this episode, and how he says like he has waited centuries for the rapture foretold in the scripture. Twice you have brought us to the brink and twice you have failed. But essentially Mr. Nobody realizes that he hasn't quite got rid of everyone for Niles. And I was waiting for this moment because he even got his tablet up, got the DC Universe streaming service up, went back to that moment that was filmed where he says, but where is she, Niles? And referring to the cave lady that Niles left behind and hid from the Bureau of Normalcy. And this is where Admiral Whiskers essentially joined the chat. This was just hilarious. They formed the Brotherhood of Dangerous Animals. I was just laughing so much at this point. And that combined evil laughter at the end, where like we had freaking Admiral Whiskers here and Ezekiel and Mr. Nobody laughing. My God, does that sum up this show? It's nearing the end of the episode now. Everyone is summoned to Doom Manor through essentially Danny the Street's distress call, and that was in the form of a song, which I can't remember off the top of my head right now, which is very annoying. But this is, of course, where we got such a huge moment in the episode where Chief was explaining that how Danny the Street got kidnapped by Mr. Nobody and put into that painting, but there was a lot more to it because the Chief's daughter was on Danny the Street, because they were essentially keeping her safe because of how threatening she potentially is. And this is where so many pennies were dropping in the same place, which made things so interesting and gave so much more context, as I said, to that flashback episode with Chief and the cave lady. So he wanted to make sure he could keep living, because obviously when Niles was hooking up with the cave lady, he was already at quite a certain age. So from that moment onwards, it kind of makes sense why he wanted to extend his own life, but he kind of did terrible things to achieve that to each Doom Patrol member. Now, where was everyone on Danny the Street? Well, they had actually been teleported to safety by Flex Mentallo. That makes complete sense because he can kind of open up new places, and he probably escorted them all to safety. It was a shame we didn't see Flex though, but I kind of understand it. There were so many things going on, but I really hope this isn't the last we see of him, because he was just executed so perfectly on this show that we have to see him again in season 2. But there was so many things happening at this moment, guys, so I'm going to try and like glisten through this, but the best I can through including everything. So this is where we see a massive Ezekiel. We got that mention from Beard Hunter and how Mr. Nobody tempted him with bags of Lincoln and also Da Vinci beard, which is just freaking hilarious. Like, he couldn't resist. So that's how Mr. Nobody learnt the truth, and how it wasn't the cave lady who was still alive and hiding on Danny the Street, it was Chief's daughter. So of course Mr. Nobody wanted to see Chief's daughter, but in trapping Danny in the painting, like, this wasn't explained mega clear, but it seems that it also trapped him too, because also maybe you could involve the daughter in that as well. We also can't forget how she's just a child as well, so yeah, she's very dangerous, but like, imagine like a little child with that much untapped power with a big imagination. That's why, Niles wanted to look after her so much. Now this is where Robot Man meets his freaking arch nemesis because of what happened before, obviously joking, but yeah, meets Admiral Whiskers whiskers in a huge form. He gets eaten. This was just all so funny. We have Mr. Nobody complaining about like how he was the villain of the show but was bested by a little girl. Now he was also thrown out of the Brotherhood of Dangerous Animals, which is just rubbing it even further, and how he was also thrown out of the Brotherhood of Evil. But if it wasn't for like Rita kind of, motivating him to assist them, and, as a result he narrated things, then we might not have got out of this mess. So Mr. Nobody, really did help out in the end, even though he also got caught up in his own thing that he caused through his narration. This is where we saw Jane go down those steps, where we saw Beard Hunter go down those steps in that episode. So this all makes sense now with that scene where we saw Beard Hunter go down there and there was that doll, and then how we had that imaginary, should I say, wolf massive thing, remember what the cave lady had conjured, and this makes sense in terms of Dorothy Spinner's abilities in the comics and how she can kind of conjure anything that she imagines. Why can't I talk? Now I'll get onto Dorothy Spinner in a second and how the Doom Patrol TV show have adapted her, because it is like blatantly different, but this is also to be expected because TV shows never completely copy and paste things like to a T, because then there's never any twists, spins, and it's not always fresh. But the way they have done her is similar. And oh my god, guys, Mr. Nobody, narrated freaking Admiral Whiskers and Ezekiel to love each other, and that was a very graphic, interesting scene, and I would never have saw that coming 1,000 miles away. But that is the beauty of this show. But weird, wacky, wonderful, crazy, all the words under the sun. But it was just spectacularly freaking insanely weird at the same time. I love it. I love it though. Keep weird random things like this coming. This is where Larry and the negative spirit essentially kind of ripped through the dimension that they were in, obviously in that painting, causing that explosion, which everyone was also shielded from because they were eaten by the cockroach. Now obviously Larry was fine because the negative spirit doesn't have radiation affecting him. I guess your explanation for the cockroach and how everyone was inside Ezekiel was because they freaking cockroaches survived mass extinction events and whatnot. So there's that explanation, because I got a feeling they weren't rushed at this part of the episode, but I can imagine there will be some people asking these questions. I love that moment with Beard Hunter and Mr. Nobody getting caught in the explosion, because he was just wondering, okay, so we get this bit and I get that bit, but then what happens to us? And that is when, of course, at the end of the episode, we get the explanation for that. They're still here, but they're trapped on that kind of canvas painting, theoretically in the white space almost. I don't know if it's exactly the white space, but of course, as they're trapped in that kind of white spacey element of that canvas, they're still here. They're just trapped together, and this leaves Alan Tudyk to return as Mr. Nobody again one day, but I don't know when. That's a whole different video. So of course Ezekiel dies with the Doom Patrol walking out of them. They're still tiny, and this is where Dorothy Spinner meets the Doom Patrol as well. And notice how we don't see her face. Now I've got a few ideas about this. Now in the comics she does have a deformed face, but I was thinking at the same time, I don't know if they had fully decided what they wanted to do with her. I don't know if that was meant to just be a stand-in, kid actor. And, since they weren't going to use her much this season, and how obviously we're going to see her next season, I wonder what they're going to do about that. Are we still going to just see her from behind? As I said, in the comics, Dorothy Spinner, she was a former member of the Doom Patrol, and due to her deformity, she did grow up outcasted from society, and they've kind of blended that into the show through her growing up on Danny the Street. But you kind of see what I mean. It's they've thrown into the mix that she's Chief's daughter, and how Chief had a relationship with that very gifted kind of cave lady woman. I'm just super interested what we're gonna see now from Chief and Dorothy Spinner next season. What are the Doom Patrol gonna do? Is it gonna be about the Doom Patrol, this dysfunctional family attempting to look after a kid who has a very vivid imagination, but not only has a vivid imagination, can bring things from her imagination to freaking life, and keep them there as long as she's alive. But that's as I said, a whole different video. We can go into that with speculation for season 2. But this episode, guys, as you can tell, this video has been going on forever now, is absolutely crazy. It was such a fitting finale. It really was. Obviously things aren't completely settled with Chief now, but I would love to know your thoughts on it down in the comments below. As I said, thank you so much for watching the reviews this season. I hope you enjoyed this one. I'm sorry if it was a bit kind of all over the place at the same time, because as I said, I could have talked about so many more things, but like it's kind of impossible to. There will be more Doom Patrol videos coming out, as I mentioned, and more DC Universe stuff in terms of we've got Swamp Thing coming very soon. We've got more Titan Season 2 stuff. Things are getting crazy with that. So stay subscribed to the channel to stay up to date with everything like that. But I'm going to say goodbye now, guys, because I got to edit this video. But leave me your thoughts and everything. I can't wait to read your thoughts on this episode. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of your day. And I'll see you Doom Patrollers next season, but also in the next video, because it'll be in between season videos, of course. I mean, come on, come on.